Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. In our last video, George Martin decided that Pete Best wasn't a good drummer, and he told Brian that he was going to get a session drummer for the recording session. George Martin didn't know it, but the Beatles weren't too happy with Pete Best either. He didn't have the chemistry with them. He kept to himself and didn't joke around like they did. It was left to Brian to get rid of him. Needless to say, Pete was hurt by the firing because he had been with the band for 2 years. So let's see what's going on today. In this chapter, Sam Leech, a 27-year-old promoter of pop dances, presented the Beatles in Merseyside ballrooms and clubs for nearly a year before Epstein arrived in their lives. And just like Brian, Leech had seen the potential of the Beatles, and he wanted to get them on records. By late 1961, he had his own record label and asked the Beatles to launch it. They agreed, but they were tied up with a German record deal. The day after Brian's first visit to the Cavern, November the 9th, 1961, the Beatles played at Sam Leech's promotion at a town ballroom in New Brighton. Leech got a telephone message from Paul McCartney asking him to reach out to John and Paul urgently. At the Cardoma Cafe, Lennon and McCartney were frank with Leech. John said, "We know we got an unwritten handshake with you, but we've been approached by Brian Epstein and he's got real money. Have a look at him and see what you think." So the three went to Brian's office in Whitechapel. John and Paul went to look at records, leaving Leech alone with Epstein. Leech said he liked Brian right away. He was a nice fellow. He was green about the music business, but was willing to learn. Brian was wrapped up with the Beatles, and since he had money, money was an easy teacher, Leech said. Paul and John went in and out of the office, and Leech faced a dilemma. He didn't want to lose the Beatles. His first thought was to advise the Beatles against Brian, but he couldn't. It would have been selfish to put them off. Instead, he tried a ploy that he thought might work. He mentioned he was thinking of starting a record label, and why didn't Brian and he do it jointly? Brian said no right away. He had bigger plans, he replied. Leech said, "I wanted to link with him because he was this rich man who loved the Beatles like me. I thought I could talk him into putting money into a record label, and that way we'd work together." And Brian didn't like the idea. It was disappointing, but I was glad for the Beatles, and I told Brian they would be a big group. Leech knew at that point that the race was over. He had tried without success to get financial backing from a top industrialist for his record label. The man refused when Leech arrived at his office with the Beatle. He said he wasn't having anything to do with Teddy Boys. Epstein didn't show guilt from getting the Beatles from Leech, and Leech said he believed he was doing them a favor and he would get the reflected glory. I don't believe, though, that deep down he thought they'd be as big as they became. He claimed he did, but it was the biggest shock in the end. He'd nearly given up when it all started happening. Leech told the Beatles, "He's the man who'll get you there." Epstein was confident, but he saw people like Leech as a threat. Sam knew more about the Beatles than he did. He understood their music better. As a street person, he had a good rapport with them. All Epstein had to offer was a power base and an impossible dream of getting a record deal. He thought that old friends would not help him get established with the Beatles, and he began to wear down the authority of people like Leech. Brian began to pressure Leech at the first Tower Ballroom show he attended. The groups there usually shared dressing rooms, but Brian said that wasn't good enough for the Beatles. They needed a private room for changing. Leech protested that this was impossible. Roy Storm and the Jerry and the Pacemakers would not tolerate that. Epstein insisted that Liverpool's top group deserved star treatment. McCartney agreed, but John was embarrassed. "That'll do, Brian." Epstein's face got red as he pulled John aside to explain the tactic. Leech gave in and gave them a private room, and it was Brian's first small step in asserting his authority. The Beatles' world in Liverpool wasn't peaceful. There were fights in the crowd, and that was a frequent occurrence. Epstein was nervous but kept his cool, and he would offer a free drink to those who got shook up. Some of the drinkers wanted to fight the Beatles. When they were in the Zodiac Club and in Joe's Cafe, the drinkers would say, "Okay, you can sing, but can you fight?" In the end, Epstein and Leech were bitter rivals. When Leech lost the Beatles, he lost the Tower. Leech said, "I didn't dream he would do that to me. I was so green." He said he didn't dislike Brian as a person, but he hated what he'd done to him. So now we get back to the fans disliking the firing of Pete Best. Best's popularity caused fans to camp out in the garden of his West Derby home as a gesture of support. Epstein faced the anger of fans throughout the city. There was an air of uncertainty with the attendance at some of the shows. They were lower than before. Sam Leech was still loyal despite not liking Brian's methods, and he booked the Beatles for a Merseyside rock festival spanning 6 venues in a week. Epstein was happy with Sam's commitment. Leech said, "I felt sorry for Pete Best, but Ringo was more in line with the Beatles. But there were some bad scenes. George Harrison got a black eye, and there was a lot of trouble around. And the fans were starting to stay away from the shows." Epstein had not warned Leech of the Ringo Best switch, and Leech was angry. He said, "I have 6 shows booked for you this week, and it's special. Couldn't you have left the change of drummer until the following week?" Epstein apologized, saying he had not thought of that way, but after what followed, Leech had cause to wonder whether it was another ploy of Brian's to force a confrontation. Sam Leech's emotional link with the Beatles was not to be severed. In 1963, when they had Love Me Do released and played the city's Grafton Ballroom, Paul dedicated Hippie Hippie Shake to Sam's wife Joan. Leech said, "I was very proud but shattered." He said to the 4 Beatles in the dressing room, "I see, lads, you're on your way now. Remember me when you're up there. Best of luck." John said, "You'll be there with us." And George, who was always the most money-conscious Beatle, laughed and said, "You still owe us 19 pounds, you know." So Leech took it to heart and said, "Lads, if I owe you 19,000 pounds, there's nothing I can do. I'm having a hard time." Leech took the view that he was not going to pay Brian that 19 pounds on the principal. Because of Epstein, he had to refund more than that in ticket repayments. He still felt he owed the Beatles money, though. By June 1964, Sam made a profit from the publication of a booklet, Beatles on Broadway. The first check he drew was addressed to Nims, and Brian wrote thanking him, saying it was not necessary, but I appreciate it was important to you, and the Beatles send their regards by the way of return. And Leech thought about the battle with Brian. No hard feelings, because although at the time it was painful, business is business, and he was good for the Beatles. Maybe if I had had the Beatles, they'd still be playing the Cavern, but Brian would be alive, and so would John. In mid-1962, Brian went to Alan Williams to discuss a joint promotion at the Tower Ballroom on July 27th. At the show, fights broke out and bricks were thrown. The bouncers had to shield themselves with dustbin lids. Brian came down the stairs to the front hall of the tower, and he found himself in the middle of a battle. A bouncer was hitting one boy, and Epstein, who was horrified, said, "Don't hit that boy, stop." And when the bouncer turned to Epstein, he told him, "Get lost." And Brian said, "But I'm the promoter." And the bouncer said, "I don't care. I'll smack you as well if you don't get out of the way." So Brian had never seen fighting like that. The Beatles were used to it, but Brian, as a very sophisticated, gentle person, was completely out of his territory. He was wondering where the police were to stop it, and the police thought that they weren't going to get there. They weren't going to be there as unpaid bouncers. Williams had to grab Brian and get him out of the way before he got hurt. Brian was scared of the fighting and didn't want the Beatles to get hurt. Brian loved the Beatles, and he was a Beatle too. The Beatles, though, were always throwing jibs and sarcasm at Brian. It would have crushed most men. In the tiny cavern dressing room, the Beatles mocked his demeanor, pulled faces behind his back, mimicked his immaculate speech, his enthusiasm, and his precise arrangements. He was a sensitive man, and when he walked away from the scorn that no one else would have tolerated, he earned their respect. Epstein admired the Beatles. He took their insults because he craved their affection. They were like his family. He came to enjoy their Liverpudlian sense of humor, and they were sharp and quick-witted. A club owner named Rick Dixon said that Brian wanted very much to be accepted by them as more than just a manager. He said he remembered Brian at the Floral Hall as he was standing by the stage. He was living every moment. He breathed every note, every minute. The hastily arranged bookings and Brian's inexperience combined to bring the Beatles less money than they could have commanded at their shows. If the record went from 15 up to 10 in the charts, the contract should say the price went up. Everybody had chart clauses, according to Dixon, but Brian didn't seem to know what those were about. He never seemed to ask about the clauses. For the Beatles, it was enough to see their bandwagon was rolling. The faith in their mentor paid off. They trusted him implicitly. They didn't mention his private life, and they were confused about his female dates at the Cavern. His discretion was admirable. They felt his relationships with women seemed so normal. So I'm going to end the video here, and we saw that the Beatle fans were a bit upset over the firing of Pete Best, and Brian was shocked at the fights that broke out at shows, but the Beatles, they were used to it. Brian, as we saw with promoter Sam Leech, did whatever it took to keep the Beatles close to him and to get them away from old acquaintances that might undermine his efforts to be the Beatles' manager. So I look forward to see what's going to happen next. I hope you liked the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. As I mentioned before, I created a list of merchandise from Amazon that I thought you might be interested in. If you go to the description part of the video, you'll see links, and if you see something you like, click on the link, and if you purchase it, I get a small commission that's of no extra cost to you. But more than that, I wish everybody a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.